Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes as all of you enter from the lobby. I am really excited to go through an amazing panel with our amazing panelists today. Really briefly, a bit of an overview of today's webinar. We'll do a quick round of introductions. Then we'll go into an update on the AA1000 SES V3. We'll then have our exciting panel discussion on stakeholder engagement in the UK utilities sector. And then we'll have some closing remarks. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by Ms. Victoria Mustard, Ms. Savannah Saunders, and Ms. Nicola Findlay. I'll talk a little bit more about who they are, where they come from, and the perspectives that they'll be offering when we get to the webinar section. But briefly about me, I am a manager in the London Office of Accountability. I've been with the firm for around 2 years now, and I've worked on a variety of different ESG projects, from sustainability strategy and reporting, data management, to secretly, I think, what is my favorite topic of all, stakeholder engagement. So excited to be kind of facilitating this discussion today. Before accountability, I worked in the climate space, everything from sort of the nonprofit sector to tech in the US, China, and Myanmar. So excited to see the very sort of diverse set of, I think, attendees we have today. A little bit about accountability. So we are a consulting and standards firm that works with businesses, investors, governments, and other organizations to really innovate and advance the global ESG agenda. We do that through improving practices, which in turn improve performance and the impact of the organizations that we work with. We have 3 lines of business: advisory, standards, and insights. And we serve our standards community and advisory clients globally out of our 4 offices in London, New York, Riyadh, and Dubai. Most of our attendees, I think, will be familiar with accountability standards, but as a refresher and for those who are less familiar, our AA1000 series of standards was initiated in the mid-1990s, so over 30 years ago, and currently consists of 4 guidance documents. We have on our far left here the AA1000 accountability principles, the assurance standard, the stakeholder engagement standard, which we'll be discussing more in detail today, and the guidance on assuring greenhouse gas emissions. All 4 of these documents have a series of supplemental guidance documents, but we believe that what really differentiates the series of standards is that it is principle-based in nature. So the 4 accountability principles of inclusivity, materiality, responsiveness, and impact serve as an anchor for our other standards and really as a foundation for responsible business practices. The AA1000 SES was launched in 2005, so over 20 years ago. And in 2015, we published the standard that has guided the field for the past decade. It's hard to believe, but another decade has passed, and I think in that time, the world has really changed. Digital platforms, social media, AI, they've fundamentally redefined stakeholder engagement, the context of stakeholder engagement. And as such, I think stakeholder voices are louder and expectations tend to be sharper, faster, much more consequential. We also have a new generation of disclosure frameworks for those who work in the sustainability field. That includes GRI, the CSRD, the ESRS, IFRS S1 and S2, the TNFD, a series of sort of different global standards and frameworks, as well as more nationally based standards, which often take inspiration from the global ones. These obviously have associated regulations, which require really credible stakeholder engagement as a condition of compliance, which makes the work that we do all the more relevant. And what we've found as a firm is that stakeholder engagement is no longer a discrete or ad hoc activity, but it's a strategic capability that is, I think, guiding good corporate governance, risk management, and long-term value creation. So this new era of engagement, again, demands a modern standard that is fit for purpose. Building on the last stakeholder engagement standard that was published in 2015, as I mentioned, the new standard preserves the existing accountability principles of inclusivity, materiality, and responsiveness, and it puts the 4th principle of impact at the forefront. So this supports some of the key changes that you can see on the slide here. The first one being around regulatory compliance and interoperability. The standard works in alignment with the disclosure requirements of GRI, ESRS, IFRS S1 and S2, and other emerging frameworks, standards, and regulations, including the B Corps. We also have digital guidance that's provided in our standard now to really encourage the use of different digital platforms in AI, which can help stakeholder engagement teams or other practitioners map stakeholders, manage engagement end-to-end, and also analyze insights at scale. We more than ever believe that engagement should be ongoing and responsive. So there's a heightened emphasis on continual engagement, which can surface emerging risks and opportunities in real time. And there is the biggest element around co-creation, which encourages a two-way dialogue that enables organizations to develop solutions with stakeholders rather than for them. So what's new here? This slide basically sums up what's new in the revised standard, 4 shifts that we think will make engagement much more purposeful, strategic, and of course, more assurable. So the first one is around clarifying the purpose of the engagement. The big change here is a structured sort of self-assessment, which can help organizations articulate why they engage and not just how. And it also forces the link between engagement activity and the organization's strategic priorities. So this can be made really explicitly upfront. It, of course, number 2, ensures that engagement is keeping strategy at its core. So engagement is no longer a standalone exercise that's siloed. It's really expected to be aligned with organizational strategy, as well as transformational priorities and key decision points where stakeholder input actually changes the outcomes. I think we'll talk a little bit more today, especially with our utilities panelists, about what that will look like and what that means. There's also stronger supporting guidance. So in our newest standard, we'll have a quite robust practitioner's guide, and that shows improved interoperability with the other standards as well. That matters for 2 reasons. It makes the standard easier to apply more consistently, and it also makes it easier for the engagement to be assured, which is increasingly what I think regulators and boards are looking for. And finally, there's an impact-focused assessment. So there will be enhanced methodologies that really help organizations evaluate the risks, opportunities, and outcomes of stakeholder engagement. So moving the conversation from sort of, you said, we heard, we did, to what difference did it really make in terms of outcomes-related engagement. So with that, I want to share that the public consultation is actually now open. So we would love to hear from everyone who's attending today on your thoughts, which can really shape the next generation of stakeholder engagement. I think it's a great way for all of you to share your expertise, contribute to leading practices, shape future requirements, and also strengthen the profession. So if you want to go ahead and click the link on the slide here or scan the QR code, we will also be following up with an email after this session. And the window is short. We are closing the public consultation period next Friday, but we would absolutely love to hear from all of you. Pause here for 2 seconds while folks are scanning the QR code. And all right, into I think what everybody is the most excited for, our panel. So our panel today is focused on stakeholder engagement in the UK utilities sector. And I'm so very pleased to be joined by our 3 panelists. We have Victoria Mustard, who's the head of engagement, who's the head of customer advocacy and management at NESO, the National Energy System Operator, where she leads strategies to enhance the customer experience and engagement across the whole energy system. So that covers everything from the whole system planning through to systems operations, market development, and energy flexibility. We're also joined today by Savannah Saunders, who is the net zero communications lead for National Gas Transmission. She is a stakeholder engagement, consultation, and communication specialist with 20 years of experience in designing and delivering integrated programs for major infrastructure projects, government agencies, as well as other high-profile organizations. She's also a member of our AA1000 SES V3 working group, and she's part of the subcommittee tasked with the development of the practitioner's guide. So if you have any questions for Savannah there, please feel free to direct them to her. And finally, we have Nicola Findlay, who our firm has worked really closely with for many years now. She's the Communications Policy Manager at Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, SSEN. She focuses on ensuring that customer and stakeholder needs are considered throughout the work that the organization does. And again, she plays a key role in the update to the SES and is our member of the Practitioners Review Committee. So thank you so much to all three of our panelists for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing so you can see their lovely faces. And then we can kick it off with some questions. So I'm going to direct the questions to one member of our panel, and then we'll open it up if there's anybody else who thinks they have something to add to the discussion. And my first question is for Victoria Mustard. So stakeholder engagement has moved up the agenda quite significantly across the UK utilities industry in recent years. What do you think is driving that, and is it the right kind of attention?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. I think for me, there's kind of three forces behind why stakeholder engagement's kind of moved up the agenda. So the first one really is regulation. That's kind of fundamentally changed the game. Under Rio, it's no longer enough to say that you've engaged. You have to evidence kind of how you've engaged, and not just have you spoken to people, but how has their input shaped your decision and outcomes. So there's really kind of been a gear shift to make engagement a core part of business planning. I think secondly, we're going through a massive energy transition at the moment, right? So that completely expanded the stakeholder landscape. Energy is much more important for people and is much more of a discussion point. So we're not dealing with a relatively stable customer base anymore. We've got local authorities, we've got flexibility providers, new market entrants, there's communities very impacted by infrastructure. And increasingly, we're looking at place-based planning. So we have to talk to the local teams, the local communities. We've had to scale engagement alongside the scale of the system, which has become much more complex and much more contested. And I think finally, we have a growing legitimacy challenge where we're asking people to use less, but fund more. So it's something that you see across all utilities. You see this in water, you see this in energy. We're asking consumers to fund major infrastructure investment and really accept visible change to their landscape in their communities. So unless people understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and why it's important, it's really about securing permission to operate these days, not just telling people what we're doing and gathering insight about it. And I think the final part of your question was, is it the right kind of attention? I think it is. I think the intent is absolutely right. It's great that we see more regulation around this. What we've got to be really careful of is that we're not just meeting regulatory requirements and we're not just ticking a box to say, yes, we have spoken to X amount of people. We're actually taking that engagement. We're engaging at the right time, not all the time, and that we're really showing how people who are giving us their opinions, we're listening and either doing something about it or explaining why we can't. That would be my view on the top three.
Absolutely. I'd agree with you there. I think much of what we've heard in sort of the UK utility sector from our sort of contacts and whatnot have really been around sort of this education piece, this informational piece. I think there's a big push to really, I think, empower stakeholders with the knowledge that they need, especially around informing and gathering consents. So I think your finger's quite right on the pulse there. Anything from our other panelists on that one based on the work that they do? Perfect. I will move on to our second question. Oh, please go ahead, Savannah. Yes.
No, again, thank you for having me. I was going to just echo what Vicky was saying. I think here at National Gas, for example, we have a really ambitious portfolio of new energy projects across hydrogen and carbon pipelines. And the sheer scale of the energy transition and the need to accelerate projects in the UK is quite unprecedented also in the number of projects that are going through our existing planning system here, where we are requiring and needing to secure consent in order to be able to deliver the change that is required. And through that unprecedented scale of change, as Vicky says, our projects are new technologies in first-of-the-kind projects, and that education piece that you talk about, Jamie, is really important, and ensuring that we put stakeholders and communities at the heart of our projects is really important. And for us, as you say, to demonstrate to our regulators that not only Are we developing projects that are technically feasible, that are going to meet the needs of the country, but also really do take into consideration the impacts that these projects can have on communities and on people and their lives? It's really important that we involve stakeholders in that development process, and that it is meaningful engagement that really does help shape our projects. And it is, as you say, there's a lot of projects. There's a lot of projects going on across the regions, and we have to really be very understanding about how our projects impact and benefit the communities and the country. It's quite a balance that we need to strike, and we are absolutely committed. And I've spent 20 years, and I'm very passionate about this subject. So I'm so pleased to be here today to talk about it. So thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Savannah. I couldn't agree more. I think there was one of our contacts who I think had shared that there are definitely folks who are more informed about many of the new projects around the sort of transition period, and folks who tend to be more informed tend to have more neutral views, if anything, around much of what's happening with the transition. So definitely a very interesting insight, and thank you for your answer. My second question is for Nicola. We would love to know more about who counts as a stakeholder in utilities. I think that group has really widened in recent years. So you have everybody from sort of communities, campaign groups, and future customers. How do you think the sector is adapting to that broader picture?
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, as you say, the definition of a stakeholder is now much more broader and more fluid. So it also includes policymakers, regulators, investors, the media, as well as groups who may not be directly involved today, but could be affected over the longer term. So what we're seeing across the sector is a shift towards recognising that engagement needs to go beyond these traditional groups and become more targeted and meaningful. So at Transmission, we're investing over 29 billion across the north of Scotland over the next 5 years. So that means taking the time to understand these different perspectives from our different stakeholder groups and tailoring how we engage. So people have different interests, level of influence and preferences. So one size fits all approach simply doesn't work anymore. So for Transmission, we've responded by taking a more structured and targeted approach. We group stakeholders based on their interests, influence, and the way they are affected, and use that to shape how our engagement strategy is designed and delivered. We have also developed more specialised teams focused on different stakeholder groups. So, for example, colleagues working with our community groups can build strong relationships and understand local priorities, while others focus on areas such as policy, the supply chain, or our customers. That helps us provide more support that is more relevant and meaningful rather than a generic sort of approach. Alongside that, we're tailoring how we engage. So that might include local conversations, structured briefings, digital engagement. As you mentioned in the introduction, that's really emphasised over the last 10 years, or even regular dialogue with future stakeholders, depending on what works best for each group. So we're more aware now that more important voices aren't always the loudest, so making an effort to reach people who don't usually engage or who may be impacted in the future is a key part of making fair and well-informed decisions.
Definitely. Thank you, Nicola. I think we see a lot of that in the new standard here, sort of around the first piece that you mentioned around inclusivity, one of the sort of accountability principles around engaging folks who aren't necessarily the loudest, but I think still need to be engaged in engagements. And then, of course, the second piece, I think, in sort of responsiveness in decentralizing that stakeholder engagement work so that it doesn't live siloed within one part of the business. What you mentioned, I think, around having many different teams involved in the process, I think, is what we see as a leading practice in the field. Anything from our other two panelists on that question?
I think the only thing I would add is the view or the segmentation of customers is now so much more nuanced. So if you just think of consumers, we kind of talk about the 4 C's. So they're a customer, they're also a consumer, they're also part of a community, and actually you're also a citizen of the not just the GB but of the world, and you will think about things in a different way. So we really have to think about how we tailor that conversation and make sure we're talking to all of the hats to the people we're talking to.
Definitely. Not a, I think, clean sort of segmentation or sort of mapping, as you mentioned, many overlapping sort of identities and whatnot, hats that people are wearing. We've definitely found that in our work as well. Our next question is for Savannah. A lot of utilities depend on people who aren't in the room, much like what Nicola, I think, was just saying. So you have communities, local authorities, as well as campaign groups. How do you bring those voices in early enough in an engagement to shape the work rather than just validate it?
As I mentioned, this is a topic that I'm really passionate about. A lot of the work that I do is in the project development, so the pre-application stage of major projects. And so it's really about developing the options that we ultimately take out to the public for consultation. But how do we develop those projects? How do we develop in the projects that I look after? How do we develop the best solution, the best route for our hydrogen and for our carbon pipelines? And the way in which we, and that I advocate for projects, is that we involve stakeholders from the outset, at the earliest opportunity, and to ensure that we involve the right stakeholders. So what does that mean? That means not sort of waiting until too late to engage stakeholders. So really working with particularly statutory stakeholders, this local authorities, our statutory environmental bodies, working with community representative groups, so landowners, so that we can really understand what their concerns are, what their areas of interest is, any information that they have that may be really helpful for developing the right route or the right solution for any other project. There are the range of benefits from involving stakeholders early is really well documented. We get better project outcomes. We get better solutions that really meet often the needs of stakeholders. And so for me, it is very much about making sure that from the very beginning, we design a program of engagement that actually we make sure that we've got the right stakeholders in the right rooms at the right times, talking to us and influencing how we shape projects. Involvement doesn't happen by osmosis, and projects and organisations over the years have been a little bit reluctant, that the tension between when is too early to engage, when's too late to engage, because what we don't want to get into a situation is we develop a project and we take it out to our stakeholders or to the communities or the public, and they say, well, we weren't involved in shaping this project. And so making sure that we undertake the engagement and plan the engagement so that we can, along the development process, get the right information, get the right feedback, ask the stakeholders for their views along the way, that we undertake consultation at the right time so that they can meaningfully shape and influence. Because then ultimately, when we come to our final solution or a final route, then this is a project that people understand, that they feel that they have ownership over, that they feel that they've been able to shape. And often stakeholders and members of the public and landowners, they don't necessarily agree with the overall project. But if they feel that they've had a voice, if they feel that they have been truly listened to, they are less likely to be voices of significant opposition, or it can be more beneficial for projects to really make sure that we include all stakeholders in the process. So I think it's first of all, it's about making sure that we develop a program that really focuses on involving stakeholders from the outset of projects and keeping that engagement and consultation continuous, as you mentioned before, throughout the life cycle of the project, so people feel that they can shape and influence. It de-risks projects, it increases understanding, it increases better outcomes. So I think it's one of the most critical factors for me for the success of projects, in addition to developing the right engineering or technical solution, is making sure that we are listening to our stakeholders and getting them to help co-create and co-design and influence our projects.
Absolutely, thank you. I think you mentioned many different things there across sort of the engagement life cycle. And I think what we're finding is that the engagement cycle starts long before an engagement begins and ends long after an engagement is over, from sort of the traditional view. So definitely very apt there. I'd be really curious, I'm going to sneak in a sneaky sort of follow-up there, but if anybody has a specific sort of follow-up or example that they could share in this one, I think a lot of practitioners, I think, love to see sort of an example for why that makes an engagement more successful. If anybody can think of one, I definitely would love to hear about it, and we can chew on it a little bit while I open up the sort of question, I guess, to our other two panelists in case there's anything they want to add.
The only thing I would add to that is completely agree with what everything that Savannah said, but just where change can't be made, just be really transparent about why it can't. So being clear on, we've taken on board, what that feedback is. Here's the reason why we can't change it, or here's an alternative that we can do. And I think that really, really helps to sort of build trust and let stakeholders feel as well that their feedback has been taken on board, although change might not have actually come from their feedback.
I think
That's
there's
such a
also
great point, Nicola.
Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, I think there's also an interesting challenge we have with, particularly with utilities infrastructure, in that you can be building utilities infrastructure in an area to benefit a different part of the country. So actually, it's also understanding why we're doing what we're doing, but what is the kind of additional or other benefits that are coming into the community. So actually, it could be around the fact that you are building some more jobs locally. And you really need to understand what the benefit of what you're doing is, not just for you, not just for your customers, but actually in the area that you're in. What else can you be doing? So I know from previous work, I've worked with the team at SGN on H100, which is like a hydrogen development area. Quite an interesting conversation. I'm not there anymore, but the conversations they were having at the team was that we were very much engaged with the community a good 2 years before we even put a spade in the ground to understand what their concerns were, what were they worried about, what do they need as a community, and how can that help, and what could we do as part of that project to help with some of the issues in the community. So it's really thinking about not just what your project has got to deliver, but what is it going to do and how is it going to bring something to that community?
Absolutely. I love both of those answers. I think a little bit sort of on your answer, Nicola, around that honesty piece, I think is just going to be very relevant to everybody on this panel and to our attendees as well. It's not always that, what is heard from stakeholders can necessarily be integrated into a project. And I think that kind of openness for when something perhaps is something that they disagree with in terms of an outcome, I think stakeholders really appreciate being told honest things. And I think that builds trust for future engagements as well. And then I think, Vicky, on your point around sort of that holistic benefits piece, in one sense, I think we've found that a lot of utilities do great work on sort of local engagement. They're very honest about sort of economic benefits that can be brought to local communities, job creation, of course, upskilling, et cetera, bringing people along in sort of the just transition. But I think at the same time, there are sort of broader conversations, of course, around what's developing nationally, right? Something that's built in your local community has far-reaching benefits for everyone else as well. So I really love both those answers and examples. Thank you so much. I would love to know more, Nicola, about how you know when stakeholder engagement is working. How do folks at your organization think about what good looks like? Are there any sort of internal KPIs or metrics that really stand out for SSEN? And how do you demonstrate those internally as well as externally?
It's a great question. Well, first of all, I don't think that there's a single measure that tells you engagement is working. It's about looking at a range of indicators, and importantly, the impact that those conversations are also having. So as both Vicky and Savannah have mentioned, it shows up in the quality of our outcomes. So you see it in stronger, more considered proposals, smoother project delivery. For us in transmission, that's reflected on things like securing our consents. So a strong consent rate is a good indication that stakeholder views have been taken on board and helped shape the design and the approach. Feedback is also important. So stakeholders, as we've already mentioned, feeling informed, understand what's happening and how their input has made a difference. We track this through consultation responses, participation levels and surveys, also through how clearly we report back. So again, what we were saying earlier, being open and honest about when things haven't been able to change, why, and helping to sort of build that trust. Internally, how you can tell engagement is working is really about how the organisation operates day to day. So engagement isn't down to one specific area or one specific team. It's something that the whole business has to contribute to. External assessments are also really important and have been really important for us. So independent audits like the AA1000 gives us an objective view of what we're doing well and where we need to improve. And the real value comes from really acting on those recommendations. So over time, that's helped us strengthen our approach, embed better practices, and align our engagement more closely with our wider strategy. That's helped get the buy-in, across the organisation. It gives confidence internally and externally that what we're doing is credible and effective.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I think that sort of impact measurement piece is really important. And of course, it has to live everywhere in the organization, not just for the stakeholder engagement team, much like you're saying. I think we find the same thing is true in sustainability, where executive pay being tied to sort of sustainability outcomes has been a huge driver for any sort of environmental action. And I can only imagine that the same would be true for stakeholder engagement. I would be very curious to know, Savannah, I think in sort of your background in communications and stakeholder engagement, there's a lot around sort of coalition building. So I think securing genuine support for these large infrastructure changes that we've been talking about from politicians, communities, and regulators requires more than just sort of basic consultation. What do you think separates engagement that actually builds coalitions from engagement that just goes through the motions as like a box ticking exercise? I think somebody on the panel mentioned that term.
So I think for major infrastructure, one of the key risks and the opportunity is about having support for your project, because without political support, without local government support, without community support, effectively your project can actually stall. I think there are a number of examples of projects in this country that have been developed, they have even been consented, but ultimately, because they haven't secured support, that they have been cancelled. And so the importance of building a coalition of support is really important, but it doesn't happen by osmosis. Building support happens by design. It needs to be a strategic outcome of your engagement planning. There needs to be, in all of our stakeholder engagement planning, there needs to be an absolute pillar and a program of advocacy building. This comes back down to identifying, and Vicky mentioned this earlier, identifying the beneficiaries of your scheme, who are going to benefit, who is going to be able to be advocates, third-party advocates, who's going to be able to voices of support to balance out what can be voices of opposition that may be opposition due to either genuine effects of this scheme, or because there's misinformation or lack of education, or because subjects become politicized. And so it happens by design. It happens by identifying those stakeholders, building a compelling narrative for projects that connects with stakeholders and connects with communities and connects with people, and to ensure that they understand what those benefits are and the rationale. And one of the challenges for individuals at an individual level and for communities is they don't really understand what's in it for me. It can be very difficult, these big complex projects that we often people feel that are being imposed, they're being done to them. And so we really need to work very hard to make sure that actually they feel that they understand and have ownership of projects, and that helps to build support as well. But I think we also have to be realistic that not all of our impacted stakeholders or interested stakeholders are going to be supporters, but there needs to be an absolute focus on a strategic outcome and a program of advocacy built into all of our engagement work. So I think there's quite a number of elements about making sure that there is a very clear vision that we can get our stakeholders behind, that we work with our stakeholders to understand how their support really will make an impact, and how they can assist our projects as well. So I think it's an activity that requires a lot of focus to be able to ensure that we get the right outcomes and build the right levels of support for long-term projects. It's very hard to sustain, and it needs to be very intentional.
Absolutely. I think back, to maybe Vicky's answer around sort of those 4 Cs, the many different hats that folks are wearing. And I think understanding the benefits of these large infrastructure projects really comes from, I think, understanding the nuances of sort of stakeholders and their many different priorities that need to be engaged in this sort of process. Anything from our other 2 panelists on that one?
So I think it was really interesting what you were saying about kind of ownership, because I think shared ownership of the outcome of the project actually really helps, because you'll be able to understand the people who can see benefits for themselves, but there might be a number of people who don't actually benefit or feel like a disbenefit, if that's a word. But if people know and understand why you've made the decisions and feel a bit of ownership of the outcome, whether that's with their citizen head on or their consumer head on, that can really help people understand. And I wish I could remember the name of the research. There's been a bit of research done recently where people, they looked at people who had benefited from a project but hadn't had a good engagement experience versus people who'd had a great engagement experience but hadn't seen but weren't necessarily getting the benefit, and they were much happier so long as they'd understood the process. It wasn't about the outcome, it was about how they'd understood and been engaged. I really wish I could remember the name of the research, but I'll find it and send it to you because it's fascinating.
It's really fascinating, yes. I would definitely love to read that. Thank you. We have another question around trust. So I think this is something that we've been alluding to throughout this discussion. Trust is really hard won in stakeholder engagement broadly, and I would say specifically in utilities right now. What do you think genuinely moves the needle on that, Vicky, versus what just looks like engagement? And I think that's actually quite a nice segue from what you just spoke about.
Yes, I mean, trust is hard one everywhere at the moment, right? We're in quite a volatile world, and there's not a lot of trust about. But I think trust is so much more than engagement. You know, I can engage with somebody every day. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to trust me. But if I act consistently, if I'm transparent about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and I can explain why it's of interest to them, then people will see that. And I think you can't just move trust overnight. So for me, it's very visible action. It's not just I'm going to listen. I want you to come and tell me what you think. I need to show what I've done and why I've done that. And I need to do that more than once. You need to see that really consistently. I think you have to be very transparent about the decisions and the trade-offs that are going to be made. This isn't going to work for everybody. We are dealing with some quite difficult challenges here, particularly when it comes to kind of energy. So we've got to be really transparent about not just what decisions are made, but why are they made and what the trade-off has been. What decisions didn't we make? I think there needs to be some clear feedback loops for people. People need to be able to see, not just once. There's no point in me going out and kind of engaging with you and again, right, I've heard what you've said. I'm going to go off and do this now. We've really got to have those feedback loops. If this is what you said, this is what we've heard, this is what we've done. Is that right? How does that work? And you just keep going around those. I think all engagement needs to be evidence-led, and you've really got to be able to trace your decisions. And I think one of the things I see a lot, particularly in energy, we're all really excited about energy. I can geek out about energy all the time. As a consumer, I want to know that if I turn the light on, it's going to come on and that I can heat my house. I don't really care how or why. I just need to know it's going to happen and that it's done in an affordable way. And sometimes we've got to be really, really think about how we're engaging at that level, not just over explaining from an engineering point of view what it is we're doing and why it's important. And that's where your credibility comes from. You really need to know and understand who you're talking to. And then that will build trust. You start with individuals, but it builds and builds as a pattern as people experience you over time.
Absolutely. I think we've definitely seen that in many of our engagements. It's that level of sort of credibility and consistency that I think matters more than anything else. These infrastructure projects are sequenced and processed, right? So you you, I think, are starting with sort of consents, and then you move on to actual building. And in these many different phases, I think engagement will look really different. But I think it's up to the organization, to the business, to really show up consistently across. You don't just sort of go quiet in one stage when you no longer need permissions and you no longer need that sort of buy-in, right? Engagement really changes based on the different phases of projects. And I definitely hear you on the transparency and the consistency points. We have one last sort of planned question, and then I think I'm seeing that there are lots of great questions coming in through the Q&A. I might sneak in one more about the standard, but before we get to that, Nicola, I have one more question for you. If you were advising a utility that is just starting to mature its stakeholder engagement practice, where would you tell them to focus first, based on your experience?
Oh, that is a great question. I would definitely say start by understanding where you currently are. So what's your current position, and where do you want to get to? Like, what's your goal? What's your ambition? So review any feedback that you've got, or actively go out and seek feedback from your stakeholders. Identify where your strengths and gaps are across the organisation, benchmarking your performance where possible. Even if relevant, an external assessment can really help here, as it'll give an independent view. And then being clear around, once you've got all of that information, right, what is your purpose and your priorities? You know, why are you engaging? What our stakeholders can influence, and how that will link to like the overall decision making. Put simple, consistent processes in place first. You know, don't start off overly ambitious. You know, that consistency, as you know, Vicky has said, across all of the projects, you know, across the organisation is really important, and build the capacity across your organisation as well. And I think the other thing is really understand that engagement needs to be treated as ongoing. You know, it's, as been said before, it's not you go out and just engage once. It needs to constantly evolve and adapt. Actions that have the greatest impact and build trust over time will also really support with, you know, increasing your overall engagement. You know, for us in transmission, as an example, you know, we've put a real focus on stakeholder engagement over the last sort of like 7 years. We've been assessed against the AA1000 since 2020, so, you know, so we've got a great relationship working against the AA1000 standard. We started off at 62%, you know, so we really had a long way to go. And over the years, you know, being consistent on building on that, recommendations, keeping ourselves accountable by committing to that annual audit, continuing to improve has really helped us increase our score. And, you know, I'm really pleased to say we're now sitting at 97%. But we also know that it doesn't end there, you know, so having that great score doesn't mean that, right, that's it, we've ticked the box, like that's us done. Absolutely not. We need to, you know, we need to keep evolving, keep adapting as things keep changing. Probably my biggest advice.
That's great advice. I think, yeah, definitely, I think the idea of sort of setting out a purpose to begin with, I think that's something that we highlight a lot, especially in V3 of the standard. And then I think a theme that's been consistent throughout this conversation has been around that sort of responsiveness, sort of ongoing engagement. I think we see that really as a leading practice across many different industries in stakeholder engagement. I think I'm going to sneak in one last question here, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&A. But Savannah and Nicola, I think from your work on helping us with this process of drafting and now releasing the standard out for public consultation, where do you find value in guidance for stakeholder engagement? And can you explain how it supports the work that you do?
So I think, like Nicola has said, here at National Gas, we have utilised the AA1000 Stakeholder Engagement Standards to underpin our corporate stakeholder engagement strategy, which has been really effective for the organisation. And we're applying the standards for the stakeholder engagement for all of our new molecules projects. And so for me, I think just the application as it currently stands has been really, really quite instrumental. And sorry, just repeat the question again.
Sorry, no worries at all. I was thinking that it was not very clear, and then I kind of sprung it on both the two of you. Yeah, I just would love to know, I think, having sort of received the behind the scenes view on the AA1000 V3, which now folks can go online and read for themselves. Where do you find its value in sort of guiding stakeholder engagement? I think you did kind of hit it already in your answer, but yeah, I will leave that there to linger.
I think it's really important as an engagement industry, to have codification of our practice, to have standards of our practice. It helps to ensure that we get investment in stakeholder engagement, which is really important for projects and organisations. I think one of the challenges that we have for the industry more broadly is I think there is a greater level of investment required in terms of stakeholder engagement, and I think having a standard that we can utilise but also and demonstrate our delivery against really helps with that case as well. So and the experience of being on the working group and updating it has been a really fulfilling experience, because working with different organisations across the globe really have brought a more sort of broader viewpoint about stakeholder engagement in different sectors and in different countries as well. So it's been a really valuable experience for me personally. But the application of the actual standards, I think, has a really important process point for us as an industry.
Absolutely.
I was just going to say that.
Nicola's unmuted. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say I totally agree with what Savannah said, and I guess it helps as well, following the standard, having the recommendations, and knowing that you're aligned to best practice really helps support buy-in across the organisation, where improvements are needed, where change is needed. So it really helps internally, and then I guess also externally. Sometimes it can be quite challenging. We've all touched on it's a challenging time for particularly the energy sector at the moment. So it helps you sort of give that confidence that actually what you're doing is aligned to best practice. So people won't always be happy, as we've said, throughout this. People aren't always going to be happy with what you're doing, and sometimes those voices can overshadow actually the work that's been done. Just because they're unhappy doesn't mean to say that your processes and practices aren't aligned in the correct way. So I guess that's one of the main drivers for us, is it helps, that confidence building both internally and externally. And it's great, being part of the practitioner group. It's really been great to input into how the new version is looking, particularly with more of a focus on that digital element, social media playing such a massive part that maybe wasn't quite as incorporated in the previous one, and also that impact as well on your engagement. So not only how you're delivering an engagement, but actually how is that impacted, outcomes. So yeah, it's really great to see.
Totally awesome. I think that folks who kind of read the standard will really see that there are these really practical elements that are input from the sort of breadth of practitioners who are included in the process, and obviously from our three panelists today. So thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for Q&A. I believe Amy is going to come on camera now and sort of prioritize the questions that have come in. Thank you so much for putting them in.
Thank you so much for your wonderful panel. It's great to hear all of your insights. Our first question is from Jenny. She's asked, reflecting back on earlier comments around the legitimacy challenge, what are the panelists' thoughts on how utilities can improve collaborative engagement, improve trust, and reduce stakeholder fatigue? I'll open it up to whoever wants to kick off.
So I'm quite happy to jump in there if that's useful. So for those of you who don't know who NESO are, we were set up about 1.5 years ago now, and we have quite a lot of conversations that have to happen across the business. So one of the things we're looking at is how do we make sure that we're engaging with a wide number of stakeholders, and we're not just talking to them, but we're actually engaging and getting their feedback. But quite often we need to talk to them about all the different areas of our business, just not all at the same time. So a big part of my role is looking at how do we bring that engagement together. And I think the simple answer is to start to think about your customers first, rather than what you need to tell them. So if you start to think about, right, okay, I need to talk to, I'm going to pick on transmission, Nicola. So I need to talk to all of the transmission operators, but I need to talk to them about 7 different things. What are all of those people that we need to engage with in the same department? have we got areas where we can have one session where we talk about 5 different topics, or are there particular topics that we really, really need to dive down on? But if we look at that from a transmission operator point of view, rather than from a NESO point of view, we'll probably approach it very differently. So if I look at it purely from a NESO point of view, I need to engage with 17 different people. I want to engage with lots of different areas, and I want to prove that I have spoken to all of these people. I've heard what they've had to say, and I've brought it on. I would go about it one particular way because I'd got that in mind. If I think about it from, I'm Nicola and I've got to answer all of these questions from NESO, but I've also got all of these other areas to think about and my own role to do, I probably only want an hour to have that conversation with all those topics, and I'll tell you what's really important to me. So I think if you flip what you're looking at and look at it from a customer point of view, that would probably lead you into the right way.
Absolutely. Savannah, Nicola, do you have anything to add on to this question? That's okay. So we have been talking a lot about the external stakeholder side, and so we've now got some questions to do with the internal management of stakeholder engagement and the team structure. So the first question is, what has been the most effective way of building internal support for stakeholder engagement activities that may not always have that immediate or obvious business return, potentially in the short term?
I don't mind elaborating on this because I think I probably touched on that in my last question, but absolutely having that sort of external assessment really helps with the buy-in. You know, we're a stakeholder-led business, you know, within transmission, and therefore it's not just something that's, as we've mentioned before, done by one specific team. Every single person across transmission has a role to play within stakeholder engagement. It's written into, you know, all of our objectives. It's one of our core responsibilities, you know, so even down to like our job adverts, you know, stakeholder engagement is all factored in. So from people starting in the business, that's very clear that stakeholder engagement is driven by everybody across transmission. So from that perspective, I don't think it's too hard to be able to get that buy-in, but having external assessments, recommendations. We also worked with like quite a number of consultants that also gave us, along with accountability, that global view of, you know, what is best practice, not just within our own industry, but, you know, as stakeholder engagement as a wide. And that's really helped us to say, right, you know, as an organisation within transmission, our mission is to be at the forefront for best practice for stakeholder engagement. So how do we do that? So we've taken on board, you know, all of those insights across the world, and, you know, really building those into actions, building those into recommendations. We also have a an independent stakeholder group that sort of test, they give us fair challenge and criticism, and I suppose our class is a critical friend as well. So we recently published our new stakeholder engagement strategy. We refreshed it last year and published it last year. And before that obviously went up to our tech members and up to our board members, it went to our independent steering group first of all to get their views, to say, right, this is what we're thinking. Do you think that that's right? Is there anything that you think that we're missing that, you know, we need to be aligned on? So I think having all of those measures in place, along with, like I touched on before, having teams who specialise in your different sort of stakeholder groups, it helps to see that sort of overall picture of where improvements are needed, and therefore you've got a number of different, you know, sort of directors that are champion that, you know, change is needed. So yeah, that really helps.
And I guess this is a nice segue into another question. You mentioned your stakeholder engagement strategy and getting that board buy-in. We have a question here that says, how do you involve the board to the definition of the stakeholder engagement approach? And what kind of feedback have you received from board members?
So could you repeat that? How do
you involve the board in defining your stakeholder engagement approach, and what kind of feedback have you received from them?
Yeah, so when we developed our new stakeholder engagement strategy, I think it was always clear that our mission was to be at the forefront of best practice for engagement. As a stakeholder-led business, we didn't need too much of a sort of buy-in, but we did multiple we followed probably multiple steps to make sure that we got that sort of buy-in at board level. So testing it out first of all with our independent stakeholder group. We took on board all of that sort of consultant work that we had done, looking at that sort of what's global best practice for stakeholder engagement, taking on board our feedback from our stakeholders as well. So there's annual surveys that we carry out, not just for our stakeholders who are impacted by our projects, but also like our other stakeholders that we engage with. So all of that sort of feedback helped us sort of understand where our gaps were and where we needed to be, or what our focus was on where we wanted to go. So we tested that out with our stakeholder group, and then we carried out like working groups internally to make sure that all the teams understood it, that they supported it, that they were aligned. It was developed up to sort of tech members before obviously it went up to the board. So there was a multiple sort of stage process that we did, and by that time, everybody was sort of comfortable, and they'd helped shape how that sort of final strategy was.
Great.
I'd also
Thanks,
add
Nicola.
that a number of our board members are also our stakeholders and customers and represent them. So there's just a real vested interest in what you're doing around stakeholder engagement from the top down. That really helps.
Absolutely. And then I guess, Vicky, this question I'm going to direct towards you because I think it's very focused on what you've been talking about on this panel. Where engagement is done by business as usual teams rather than those central specialist engagement teams, what do you think is the best way to generate interest in best practices?
So we go really simple. So we have Eric, and we talk to people about humans. So Eric is it easy to understand? Is it reliable information? Is it impartial? And is it credible? Simple as that. If you apply that to what you're looking at, you don't have to be a stakeholder expert. You have to be a human, I would say. So ultimately, you're talking to another human. So when we're talking to sort of teams who aren't necessarily people who work within this day to day, it's just right. The people you're talking to are human. Have we made it as really easy to understand as we can? Is it reliable information? So can we show where the data sits? What are we trying to explain? And have we pitched it right? And then if you've done that, and we have to be impartial, and is it credible? Are we showing the data that supports that conversation? It's a conversation at the end of the day. It just depends whether that is done on paper, face to face, one-to-one, or one-to-many. And I think if you apply just human principles like that, you can't go wrong.
Great. I'm going to definitely note down that acronym and start using it going forward. I have another question here, and I've got two more left. I know we're almost at time, but I'm going to quickly try and speed through these. So taking an example of a company that has recently designed and implemented a stakeholder engagement plan and process, what do you think are the 3 to 5 key factors for creating that long-term shared value? So emphasizing the building trust and continuous stakeholder engagement that we've been talking about. I'll open it up to whoever wants to kick off.
I was just going to say that probably touches on what I've spoken about before. So having that sort of clear plan on where you're intending to go. For us as an organisation, we see our stakeholder engagement strategy as a longevity sort of plan. So it's something that whilst you might need to refresh it, sort of regularly, the whole refreshing entirely, like our commitments to our stakeholders are there for longevity. And I guess one of the key things is to sort of like build trust with our stakeholders is evidence how you're delivering on your strategy. So having like an action plan where it outlines, okay, what are your commitments to your strategy? How does that then translate? What actions are you actually going to take? And then I guess what we've said throughout this webinar as well is being really transparent around, right, we said we would do this is how we've done it, so sort of evidence in like a year-on-year progress and how you're delivering on that strategy. Probably that's one of the main things. I don't know if Vicky or Savannah have got any other views on that.
I just completely agree. I think this isn't a short-term one-off. This is something that you have to do consistently and make it part of what you do as a business. Sorry, Savannah, jump in.
No, I was just going to agree with pretty much everything you've just said there, Nicola. So yes, didn't mean to interrupt there.
I guess that leads very nicely onto our last question of the day. And it's all to do with the centralization of your stakeholder engagement approach. So what governance mechanisms have you implemented to coordinate stakeholder engagement across the organization, given that the responsibility for it is often decentralized?
So I can talk about.
Go for it, Savannah.
No, I was just going to say, because I work on projects and I work on a portfolio of projects where there are shared stakeholders across projects, it's really important that we have got clear governance in terms of what our approach to engagement is, who we're going to be talking to, what we're going to be talking to them about, and make sure that the information and the feedback from those engagements being brought back into the business, and that we have got a number of mechanisms that help to design and deliver and report on engagement in terms of the quality and the quantum of engagement as well. And so also the stakeholder engagement for projects is baked into all of the governance arrangements for our projects. So whilst we have governance for our own engagement work streams, we are also really critical to the overall governance of our projects, which is slightly different, but potentially to at an organisational level. But I think it can be reflective of working at a corporate level, but also on a project level as well.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone who submitted your questions and to all our panelists, of course, for all your insightful responses. I'm going to hand back over to Jamie, who's going to close us out.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you to everyone who attended for the wonderful questions, as well as our panelists for their very insightful answers. I think that would be very helpful from a practical sense for those who submitted questions. So I wanted to just remind everybody that this webinar qualifies as a CPD credit, and there are more opportunities to earn CPD credits, as you can see on the slide here. On the 14th, there will be an Ask Me Anything session hosted with Mark Rudder, the director at Tractivity. And we are still sort of figuring out an event for August, which will be around how sustainability is being integrated into major sporting events. So for those of you who've been tuning into the World Cup, very relevant. We're hopefully going to have some folks from both the European and American, as well as some Middle East folks joining us on that topic exactly. And finally, I wanted to do a big thank you to our panelists, Vicky, Savannah, and Nicola. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your guidance with our attendees. If there are any sort of follow-up questions that you have for us or for them, you can feel free to contact standards@accountability.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Me too.
Bye.